Why is English a hard language to learn? And let me clarify, I'm not saying that English is a super hard language or that it's harder than other languages. I'm saying, what are the elements that make English hard? Because every language that you might learn has certain elements that make that language hard to learn. To an extent. For you, certain languages might be easier than other languages to learn. However, every language has its hard elements, the elements that make it hard. So let's talk about 3 things, in my opinion, that make English a hard language for many people. 3 elements that cause problems for English learners. And hopefully, I don't discourage you with this video. Hopefully, I can kind of motivate you to get over these obstacles, these hurdles, as we say. So I'm going to talk about 3 different elements that make English a hard language. And the last one, the third one, is by far the hardest, in my opinion. So make sure you watch until the end, because the third one is really the hardest thing. And I want to kind of encourage you with that thing and really help you understand it a little bit more. I think after hearing me talk about it, you'll have a better understanding of the English language, and I think you'll be better equipped mentally to approach English with the right ideas, the right mindset, let's say. So let's talk about the first thing that makes English harder than some other languages, specifically for this element, which is phrasal verbs. Okay, I know that English learners spend a lot of time worrying about phrasal verbs, and this is one of the questions I get the most. People ask me about phrasal verbs. How do I learn phrasal verbs? Why are there so many phrasal verbs? What tips do you have for English learners who want to learn phrasal verbs? I get this question over and over again. And there are a few reasons why phrasal verbs cause problems for people. But really, they shouldn't be seen as so daunting, so scary. Okay. So the first thing I want to mention is that English learners have an idea of phrasal verbs. That is not the best idea or the best way to think about them. I'm not saying every English learner has this, but many people have this, and that is English. Learners think of phrasal verbs as being a verb plus a preposition, and each element, the verb and the preposition, have their own meaning, and you combine them, and they create a new meaning. And it sounds really complicated when you think of it like that. And I get questions like this from students where they say, "Why do you put up on the end of bring, for example? Why the up there? Why does up need to be there? What does it have to do with up?" And you can see that they don't have the right mindset when it comes to phrasal verbs. Because let me tell you, a phrasal verb is just a vocabulary phrase. Okay, that's all it is. It's a vocabulary phrase, meaning don't think of the two separate elements. Just think of the entire phrase and think of it as another vocabulary word. It just has two words or three words. Okay, so I know that in many of your languages, this doesn't exist. This concept of phrasal verbs either doesn't exist or it's just not like it is in English, but that's okay. If you come at it with the right mindset, then it won't seem as hard. However, it is hard in the sense that the fact that we have phrasal verbs means that we have more vocabulary in English. Okay? Let me tell you why that is. That's because many phrasal verbs are synonyms for other words that are just like one word. So, for example, bring up, the phrase I just used a minute ago. Bring up is kind of like a synonym for mention in some contexts. Bring up can have different meanings, but one of the meanings is to mention. I can say, "Why did you bring up that topic? Why did you mention that topic?" So the fact that we have the phrasal verb bring up means that we have more vocabulary because mention already exists. And now you have another vocabulary phrase, bring up. So it just adds more words, more vocabulary to the language. If a language doesn't have all of these phrasal verbs that are synonyms, like go in and enter, for example, you can think of tons of them. If a language doesn't have all of those synonyms with phrasal verbs, there's going to be less vocabulary overall. So yes, one thing that makes English hard is that there's more vocabulary because there are tons of phrasal verbs. Okay, and by the way, if you're interested in learning phrasal verbs and getting practice with phrasal verbs, I have a very exciting announcement, which is that I'm going to be releasing specific phrasal verb podcast episodes once a week starting, I think, August 2nd. I think it is. I'm forgetting the date of the first one, but very soon I'm going to be releasing phrasal verb episodes in addition to my normal podcast episodes. And so, I'm going to help you learn phrasal verbs in a natural way through listening how you're supposed to learn phrasal verbs. Okay, so phrasal verbs are tricky, but you don't have to think of them as being really scary or some really complex element. Just think of them as vocabulary words that have more than one word. It's a vocabulary phrase, and I'm going to help you learn phrasal verbs. So just start listening to my phrasal verb episodes once a week. Okay, so the first thing is phrasal verbs. That's the first thing that I wanted to mention that makes English hard. The next thing is the irregularity of English. What does this mean? This means that English is not very consistent in a lot of its rules and in the whole system in general. So this is the case for multiple languages, like French, for example. I'm learning French, And French is also pretty irregular. And in some other languages, there's a lot more regularity. It's the opposite, like Spanish, for example. Spanish, in my opinion, is a very logical, regular language for the most part. Of course, there are some irregularities here and there, but really, by and large, languages like Spanish are pretty regular versus languages like English. English is not regular at all. And one big reason for that is because English has major influence from other languages, right? Like Latin and French and Greek and English is a Germanic language. So think of that. It's a Germanic language. That's how it's classified. But it has tons of influence from Latin and French and Greek and probably some other languages. And so you have a system and you have different elements like spelling, which are completely irregular, right? They really don't make sense a lot of the time because the spelling of different words comes from these different influences, these different languages. Okay? So some words have a really weird spelling, and you realize because it's like a French word that we've kind of appropriated, right? So things like that. So you can probably think of some examples like the word cough versus coffee, right? How do you those two words? Very differently, right? One is C-O-U-G-H, cough, and the other C-O-F-F-E-E, but they sound almost the same, cough and coffee. So why would they have such different spellings? Well, you can understand why now. Because of the irregularity, the influence from different languages. English can be hard for that reason, and it's tricky, right? Because you don't really know how certain words are spelled until you see them, right? Or you don't really know some of the irregular forms or whatever until you hear them many times, because it doesn't follow a very regular, consistent pattern a lot of the time. So that's a big thing with English. The irregularity of the language definitely causes issues for English learners. But this is something that you should embrace, meaning you should accept this and welcome this because it's kind of an interesting element of English. The irregularity, the influence from multiple different languages. This is one of the cool things about English. I think. Yes, it can be tricky because of the irregularity, but it's also a rich language because of its irregularities. Right now, I'm learning French, and French has a lot of irregularities because it has, like English, some pretty heavy influence from other sources, right? And because of that, there are some things that look very strange in French, for example. Or you think, is that really a word? And I've learned to just kind of accept this and embrace it and say, oh, cool. You know, It's something that makes French more interesting to learn. This variety, this irregularity. So I think that you can do that for English as well. You can just learn to accept it, to embrace it, and to not get frustrated by it, and say, why do we have these words like though? Tough, through, thorough, taught, that all kind of look somewhat similar and have these silent letters, these GHs, etc., right? If you get frustrated by that, and you stay frustrated, your language learning process is going to be harder, right? But if you say, whoa, this looks kinda crazy, but I want to learn it anyway, if you have a better attitude about it, it won't be that hard. Okay? Because the way you're thinking about it puts obstacles in front of you. If you have the mindset that this is so hard, this doesn't make any sense. English is super irregular. I hate this. If you have that mindset, then it's going to be a lot harder for you. Okay? So try to come at English. Approach English with a mindset of accepting the weird stuff. Okay? Accepting the irregularities. Okay. All right. This is the one you've all been waiting for. What is the hardest thing about learning English? For me, this. As an English teacher with years of experience teaching, training people, learning languages, comparing languages, for me, it's not even a question. It's no doubt for me. What is the hardest element of English? And that is the stress timing of the language. What does that mean? Some of you already know if you've heard me talk about this in different podcast episodes, but I'm sure many of you have no idea what I mean by stress timing. So, some languages are what we call syllable-timed languages. This basically means that each syllable in every word, every sentence has more or less the same or a similar length. Okay? So there isn't a big difference in how long the syllable is, how stressed each syllable is. So you can clearly hear all of the different syllables in the language. So Spanish is a great example of this. Spanish is a syllable-timed language, so there isn't a huge difference in length between the different syllables in Spanish. However, some languages are not syllable-timed. They are stress-timed. English is one of the extreme examples of this. So, it's an extremely stress-timed language. So what does that mean? A stress-timed language is a language in which the stressed syllables are way longer than the unstressed syllables. We're talking almost 4 times longer, if I'm not mistaken. So imagine a stressed syllable is held for let's say, 3 times the length of an unstressed syllable. That means that many syllables in English are going to sound so fast that you have a hard time hearing them if you're not really advanced in the language. And this also affects not just your listening, but your pronunciation. Because if you don't have this variety in the stress of different syllables, the length of different syllables, then you're not going to be pronouncing words correctly. So this affects your listening, your comprehension, and it really affects your pronunciation as well. And the other thing about stress-timed languages, it's not just that the length of the syllables is very different. It's that the length of time, the amount of time between stressed syllables, should be about the same between every stressed syllable, regardless of how many unstressed syllables are between those stressed syllables. I know that sounds crazy, or it sounds hard to understand. Let me show you a very clear example of this. So let's imagine the phrase, sadly, no. So someone asks me, have you ever been to Japan? And I say, sadly, no. I have 3 syllables. The first syllable is stressed, and the third syllable is stressed. Sadly, no. I have sad and no. Those are my stressed syllables. And I have 1 syllable in the middle that doesn't have primary stress. However, because it's just 1 syllable in between these 2 stressed syllables, we don't have a lot of reduction. We don't reduce that syllable too much. Okay, you can still hear it clearly. Sadly, no. However, imagine we had more syllables in between those 2 stressed syllables. So let's say we have the phrase, fortunately, no. So now listen. Fortunately, no. We have 5 syllables there. The first one is stressed for, and the last one is stressed no. But now we have 3 syllables in the middle that don't have stress. So like I just said a minute ago, it doesn't matter how many syllables are in the middle of the stressed syllables. It needs to be the same length as the other phrase, sadly, no, that had just 1 unstressed syllable in the middle. So those 3 unstressed syllables in fortunately, no, have to be really fast. They have to be reduced. They have to sound really, really short. In order to keep the proper stress timing, in order to have the same amount of time between the 2 stressed syllables. So, listen to the difference. Sadly, no. Fortunately, no. It's basically the same amount of time between that first stressed syllable and the last. But in the second phrase, there are 3 syllables, so I have to say them really fast. Fortunately, no. So, I say, fortunately, no. Sadly, no. Fortunately, no. You hear that? It's pretty much the same length. Sadly, no. Fortunately, no. Okay, so I hope you understood that, because this is a really, really important concept in English. I can't stress this enough. I know for some of you, this might sound boring. Like, what is this guy talking about? But this is the main, or one of the main reasons why a non-native English speaker does not sound like a native speaker. Even if they say everything correctly, they have perfect grammar. Even if they pronounce all of the different letters correctly, all the vowels correctly, and the consonants, if they don't have the correct stress timing, they don't sound like a native speaker. And unfortunately, this is something that you can't just master very quickly. This is something that takes a really long time to master, in the sense that if you want to sound like a native speaker, it's going to take a really long time. And I don't want to discourage you here, because I know that sounds negative. But I don't think that your goal for most of you should be to sound like a native speaker, because that's such a big, unrealistic goal because of this stress timing that you're always going to be frustrated, because it's going to feel like you can never sound exactly like a native speaker. It's not just like, follow these 3 rules, and then you'll have the perfect stress timing in your language. No, it doesn't work like that. So what I recommend is that you become aware of this concept. By the way, when people watch my listening practice seminars or my pronunciation seminars, usually they have this realization of like, wow, I've never even heard of this before. And it changes their whole way of thinking about the sound system and the stress system in English. So this is something that usually people never hear about. They never learn about. But if they can just become aware of this, it really helps them kind of visualize the language better. You can understand why it's so hard to understand something in English, even when you can read it and understand it. I'm sure that's happened to you many times, where you can read something in English and you understand it. But if you heard that same sentence without seeing it, then you wouldn't understand like 60 or 70% of it, right? Why is that? If you know the words, why can't you understand it? And that's usually because you're not understanding all of the individual sounds that have been reduced, because they're unstressed syllables, okay? So I don't mean to discourage you with this. Like I said, I know I'm talking about how hard this is. I know I'm saying that this is something that takes like a lifetime to master. But that's not a problem, because, again, your goal shouldn't be to sound like a native speaker. You should try to sound as close to a native speaker as possible, right? That's a healthier mindset. Not to say, I need to sound like a native speaker, because the stress timing, the stress system of English is so complex that if you're not a native speaker, if you didn't grow up speaking this language, it's very hard to master it. Some people have gotten close. I've heard some really impressive language learners and polyglots that have learned English as an adult, and they sound really good. But if you listen to them long enough, like they might sound like a native speaker for 10 seconds. But if I keep listening to the video after 30 seconds or 40 seconds, I can tell, that didn't sound right because of some issue with the stress. They overly stressed a certain syllable, or they didn't reduce a syllable enough, or didn't stress a syllable enough, or whatever. Sooner or later, something comes up in their speech that shows that they're not a native speaker. So even the greatest language learners who have done an amazing job learning English, as an adult, even for them, it's very, very hard to just sound like a native speaker 100% of the time, because English is very complicated in terms of its stress timing, that whole system. So I would encourage you to have a healthier mindset, a healthier goal, to try to get better and get closer to sounding like a native speaker. But don't expect to be able to be exactly like a native speaker 100% of the time. You'll be frustrated because it'll feel like you're just not there. Okay, so I do want to recommend that if you're interested in learning more about the sound system, the stress system, I should say in English, then I highly recommend that you check out my listening practice seminars and my pronunciation seminars, because this is what we do. We practice with these types of things that are very challenging, related to stress and reduced speech and things like that. And so, if you're interested in that, make sure to sign up for my membership. It's just $2 a month to sign up if you want my listening practice seminars, and then $3 if you want the pronunciation ones as well, and then $4 if you also want my advanced podcast episodes in which I speak at normal speed, and my sound training videos in which we look at some difficult sound patterns in English, and I help you with them. So all of that you can access by clicking on the link down below, and I hope that I didn't discourage you, like I said, with this video. I just wanted to discuss some of the elements that I think make English challenging, especially this third element, right? But I want to encourage you to continue practicing, continue doing your listening, your speaking, all of that. And little by little, these challenges are going to become a little bit less challenging. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm really enjoying this format. I feel like I'm just talking to a friend of mine, so I hope you like these videos. And you can always activate the automated subtitles. I'm not going to subtitle these videos, but if you click on the settings button, down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can activate the automated subtitles, and it will be correct most of the time. So feel free to do that if you need help understanding in these videos. All right, thank you for watching this video, and I'll talk to you in the next one.